Picture this. It's a hot evening in ancient Uruk around 4,000 years ago. The sun is setting over the ziggurat, casting long shadows across the courtyard. A family approaches the temple, their hands trembling as they carry offerings. Bread, beer, a small clay figurine. But they're not walking with joy or reverence. They're terrified. Inside, massive statues of the Anunnaki loom in the flickering lamplight, their stone eyes seeming to follow every movement. The family whispers prayers, not of gratitude or love, but of desperate appeasement. Please don't notice us. Please don't be angry. Please let us survive another year. This wasn't worship. This was survival. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make it. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time. I check the comments and it's like Tokyo at dawn, London at midnight, all at once. Here's something nobody really talks about in those neat sanitized history books. The oldest gods humanity ever worshipped weren't benevolent protectors watching over us with kindness. They weren't cosmic parents guiding their children toward enlightenment. They were entities that made people shake with genuine bone-deep fear. And none were more feared than the Anunnaki. You've probably heard the name, maybe from conspiracy theories about ancient astronauts or alternative history documentaries. But strip away all the modern mythology and get back to the original sources, the actual clay tablets written in cuneiform script thousands of years ago, and you find something far more disturbing than aliens or space travelers. You find gods who created humanity not out of love but out of necessity. Gods who saw humans as tools, as slaves, as expendable workers to ease their own burdens. Gods who would drown the entire world when humanity became too loud, too numerous, too annoying. The Anunnaki weren't worshipped because they were good. They were worshipped because the alternative was unthinkable. Think about that for a second. What does it do to a civilization's psyche when their creators, their gods, the most powerful beings in their understanding of reality, view them with indifference at best and contempt at worst? When every prayer is essentially begging not to be noticed in the wrong way, when temples aren't houses of comfort but monuments to fear. For over 3,000 years, from the earliest Sumerian cities to the fall of Babylon, the Anunnaki cast a shadow over human consciousness. Their stories were carved into clay and stone, copied and recopied by scribes who understood that these weren't just myths. These were warnings, instructions, a cosmic hierarchy that put humanity firmly at the bottom, existing only at the whim of beings who could create or destroy on a scale we could barely comprehend. And here's what makes this even more unsettling. Those ancient tablets, buried under desert sand for millennia, hidden in the ruins of collapsed civilizations, they're still being translated, still revealing secrets. And the more we read, the more we understand why the Mesopotamians approached their gods with dread instead of devotion. The question isn't whether the Anunnaki were real in the way ancient people believed. The question is, why did humanity's first civilizations create gods who inspired terror? What experiences, what understanding of power and hierarchy, what deep cultural trauma led them to imagine divine beings who saw humans as beneath consideration? Tonight, we're going back, way back, to the origins of human civilization and the dark gods who claim to have made us. Before humanity built pyramids, before they wrote laws, before they even had a proper concept of civilization, there were the Anunnaki. The name itself carries weight across millennia. Anunnaki. In Sumerian, it means something like those who from heaven to earth came, though some scholars translate it as offspring of Anu, or those of royal blood. Either way, the meaning is clear. These weren't beings born from this world. They came from somewhere else, somewhere above, and they brought with them power that ancient humans could barely comprehend. To understand who the Anunnaki were, you have to understand the Sumerian cosmos. This wasn't the universe we know today, mapped and measured and explained by physics. This was a universe of layered realms, each one stacked on top of the other, like the ziggurats the Sumerians would later build to honor these beings. At the top was An, or Anu, the heaven realm, domain of the sky god whose name literally meant heaven itself. Below that was Kai, the earth, where humans struggled and survived. And below that, deeper than the deepest well, was Kur, the underworld, a place of darkness and dust where even the gods feared to tread. The Anunnaki existed in all three realms. That's what made them so terrifying. They weren't confined to heaven like the distant, untouchable gods of later religions. They walked the earth. They descended into the underworld. They moved between realms with an ease that humans could only watch with dread and awe. At the top of the Anunnaki hierarchy stood Anu himself, king of the gods, lord of heaven, father of all. But here's the thing about Anu. He was distant, removed, almost abstract. The ancient texts describe him as dwelling so far above the earth that he rarely involved himself in human affairs directly. He was power incarnate, but power that operated through intermediaries, through his sons, through his appointed rulers on earth. When Anu did take notice of humanity, it was usually because something had gone catastrophically wrong. Beneath Anu came Enlil, and this is where things get uncomfortable. Enlil was the storm god, the wind god, the god of breath and atmosphere. The Sumerians called him Lord Air, but that makes him sound gentle, doesn't it? There was nothing gentle about Enlil. He was the god who brought devastating floods, the god who sent plagues when humanity grew too numerous or too loud, the god who, according to the Atrahasis epic, decided to wipe out the human race entirely because their noise disturbed his sleep. This wasn't a benevolent protector. This was a being of immense power and terrifying temper, a being who saw humanity as useful, but ultimately disposable. Then there was Enki, and Enki is fascinating because he's the closest thing the Anunnaki had to a friend of humanity, god of wisdom, of fresh water, of crafts and magic. While Enlil wanted to destroy humans during the Great Flood, Enki secretly warned one man, giving him instructions to build a boat and survive. But don't mistake Enki's occasional kindness for pure benevolence. The same texts that show him helping humanity also show him creating humans as slave labor, show him manipulating, deceiving, using humans for purposes they couldn't understand. He was the clever god, the trickster, and tricksters help you when it serves their interests. Ninhursag, sometimes called Nintu or Mamu, was the mother goddess, the creator. The texts describe her mixing clay with divine blood to form the first humans. She shaped them with her hands like a potter making vessels. But she didn't create them out of love or nurture. She created them because the Anunnaki needed workers, needed servants, needed beings capable of labor, but not powerful enough to threaten divine authority. These stories come to us from texts that are almost impossibly old. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, carved into clay tablets that have survived 4,000 years. The Atrahasis epic, which tells the story of human creation and the flood with details that would later echo through Hebrew scripture. The Epic of Gilgamesh, where the Anunnaki appear as judges of the underworld, deciding the fates of the dead. Cylinder seals showing robed figures of enormous size standing among smaller human forms. Temple hymns describing their terrible glory, their overwhelming presence. And here's what strikes you when you read these original texts. Not the modern interpretations, not the sanitized versions, but the actual ancient words. The Sumerians didn't romanticize the Anunnaki. They didn't describe them as wise teachers who lovingly guided humanity toward enlightenment. They described them as powerful, capricious, often cruel, beings to be feared and appeased, gods who demanded tribute, sacrifice, absolute obedience. The ancient texts talk about their radiance, their melem, a kind of terrifying luminosity that paralyzed humans who came too close. They describe the Anunnaki as beings so overwhelming in presence that mortals would collapse, unable to bear even looking at them directly. Take a moment, if you would, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm curious how far these ancient stories have travelled, how many time zones they're crossing tonight as you listen. The physical descriptions are unsettling when you piece them together. These weren't invisible spirits. The texts describe them as having bodies, wearing elaborate costumes, carrying weapons that could level mountains. They ate and drank, though their food was described as the food of life, something humans couldn't consume. They travelled in divine boats and flying thrones. They lived in temples that required hundreds of humans to maintain. They were present, physical, real in ways that later gods would never be. And they were watching, always watching, judging, deciding whether humanity deserved to continue existing for another season. Picture yourself in ancient Mesopotamia, sitting in a mud-brick temple as a priest recites the story of your creation. But this isn't a comforting bedtime story. This isn't a tale of loving gods who crafted humanity with care and affection. This is the Atrahasis epic, and what you're about to hear will define your entire understanding of your place in the cosmos. You weren't made to be cherished. You were made to dig ditches. The story begins not with humanity, but with a problem the gods were having among themselves. For thousands of years, the lesser gods, the Igigi, had been doing all the hard work of maintaining creation. They dug the irrigation canals that made the Tigris and Euphrates flow properly. They dredged the riverbanks, built the temples, farmed the fields that fed the higher gods. They did all of this while the great Anunnaki, the senior gods, the ones who actually mattered, reclined in their celestial palaces and enjoyed the fruits of others' labour. This arrangement worked for a long time. But here's the thing about eternal servitude. Eventually even gods get tired of it. After 40 years of backbreaking labour, some versions say 3,600 years, the Igigi had enough. They gathered their tools, their spades and baskets and picks, and they marched to the house of Enlil, the chief god, the lord of the wind, the one who'd been giving them orders all this time, and they didn't come to negotiate, they came to revolt. The Igigi surrounded Enlil's house in the middle of the night. They set fire to their tools. They declared they would work no more. The hymns describe Enlil's terror at being confronted by an angry mob of lesser deities. He called an emergency council of the great gods. They had a serious problem. Without the Igigi to do the actual work of maintaining creation, everything would collapse. The canals would silt up. The fields would go fallow. The temples would crumble. The whole cosmic order that the Anunnaki had established would fall apart. But the great gods weren't about to start doing manual labour themselves. That would be beneath them. They needed a solution, and the god Enki, the clever one, the lord of wisdom and the underground waters, he had an idea. A terrible, brilliant idea. Why not create something new? Something that could bear the burden of the gods, but something that wouldn't have the power to rebel effectively. Something expendable. They would create humans. But here's where the story gets truly disturbing. The process wasn't gentle or divine in the way you might imagine. This wasn't God breathing life into Adam's nostrils in some garden paradise. This was cosmic butchery in the service of convenience. The gods seized one of the Igigi. We're told his name was Geshtue, the god who had intelligence. They slaughtered him, not as punishment necessarily, but as raw material. They drained his blood into a basin, and they mixed it with clay from the Abzu, the primordial underground ocean. Nintu, the mother goddess, took this gruesome mixture, this clay saturated with divine blood, and she began to shape it. She created 14 pieces, 7 male and 7 female, and from these pieces she fashioned the first humans. The text is explicit about what happened next. She pinched off 14 pieces of clay. In her wisdom she gathered them together. 7 she appointed on the right, 7 she appointed on the left. Between them she placed the brick mould. This wasn't the careful sculpting of a beloved creation. This was mass production. This was a factory assembly line for making servants. And the gods were explicit about why they were doing it. The text records their declaration perfectly. Let man assume the drudgery of God. That's it. That's the entire purpose of human existence according to the Atrahasis. We were created to do the work the gods didn't want to do anymore. Think about what this means. In the Hebrew Bible, humans are made in God's image, given dominion over creation, placed in a garden of plenty. In many creation myths around the world, humans are beloved children of the gods, created out of love or loneliness, made to be companions or heirs. But in Mesopotamia, the civilization that gave us writing, mathematics, astronomy, and law, humans are explicitly tools. We're sophisticated tools, sure. We have the blood of a god mixed into our clay, giving us intelligence and capability. But we're still tools. Our consciousness, our ability to think and plan, wasn't a gift meant to elevate us. It was a feature installed so we'd be better at maintaining irrigation systems. The psychological weight of this origin story is staggering. Imagine growing up in ancient Sumer, hearing this tale recited in the temples, knowing that every priest and king accepted it as literal truth. You exist to serve. Not metaphorically, not as some spiritual principle, but fundamentally and explicitly. Your ancestors weren't created free and then fell into servitude through some tragic mistake. You were designed from the very beginning to be a slave to beings incomprehensibly more powerful than you. And here's the really insidious part. You can't even resent it effectively, because those beings did give you life. The blood of Geshtui flows in your veins. You have intelligence because a god died to provide it. You're not just a slave. You're a slave made from the body of your master's enemy, constantly carrying the reminder of what happens to gods who rebel. Every thought you think, every clever solution you devise, every moment of consciousness you experience exists only because the Anunnaki needed smart slaves instead of dumb ones. This is why the relationship between humans and the Anunnaki was fundamentally built on fear rather than love. How could it be otherwise? These weren't parent figures who wanted the best for their children. These were cosmic employers who created workers and expected productivity. The temples weren't homes where you went to commune with loving deities. They were workplaces where you reported for duty. The offerings and sacrifices weren't gift given in gratitude. They were wage payments, compensation for being allowed to exist at all. The Atrahasis doesn't hide this. It doesn't dress it up in comforting language. It states plainly that after creating humans, the gods imposed the toil of the gods on humanity and set them to work. The same back-breaking labour that had driven the Igigi to rebellion was now the daily reality for every human being. Digging canals, maintaining fields, building temples, and unlike the Igigi, humans didn't have the power to march on Enlil's house and demand better conditions. You were made to serve, and you would serve, or you would suffer. That was the fundamental cosmic order. That was the truth underlying all of Mesopotamian civilization, and that truth shaped everything that came after. Before humanity existed, before the first human hand ever shaped clay or tilled soil, there were already slaves in the cosmos. They were called the Igigi, and they were gods. Lesser gods, yes, but gods nonetheless. Divine beings with immortal blood flowing through their veins, with powers that would seem miraculous to any human who would eventually walk the earth. And they were utterly miserable. The ancient texts don't romanticize their existence. The Igigi were laborers, plain and simple. While the great Anunnaki reclined in their celestial palaces, making cosmic decisions and enjoying the fruits of creation, the Igigi dug. They hauled, they built, they suffered. Picture divine beings, creatures of heaven, spending their endless days up to their waist in mud, digging irrigation canals across Mesopotamia. Imagine immortal hands blistering from handling stone and timber, constructing ziggurats and temples that would honor the very gods who commanded their servitude. This wasn't occasional work. This wasn't a brief period of contribution to some greater cosmic project. This was their entire existence, day after day, year after year, century after century. For 3,600 years, the texts tell us. 3,600 years of backbreaking labor. Let that number sink in for a moment. Human civilization as we know it is barely 5,000 years old. The Agigi had been toiling in divine servitude for longer than the entire span from the first Sumerian cities to the present day. They predated every human empire, every human achievement, every human thought. And all that time, they were digging ditches for the Anunnaki. The text known as the Atrahasis Epic describes their work in devastating detail. They excavated the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, creating the waterways that would eventually make Mesopotamia fertile enough to support the first human civilizations. They dredged channels, built embankments, constructed the entire hydraulic infrastructure of the cosmic order. And they did it with their own hands, their own strength, their own sweat. Even gods could sweat, apparently, when the labor was hard enough and the overseers demanding enough. But here's what makes this story so unsettling. The Agigi weren't slaves because they'd done something wrong. They weren't being punished for some cosmic crime or rebellion. They were slaves simply because they were lesser. Because in the hierarchy of divine beings they occupied the bottom rung. Because the Anunnaki needed work done, and the Agigi were there to do it. It was their nature, their purpose, their inescapable destiny. They had been created to serve, until one day they decided they hadn't. The rebellion didn't happen suddenly. According to the texts, it built slowly, like pressure accumulating behind a dam. The Agigi grew tired. More than tired. They grew desperate. The work was becoming too much, the burden too heavy, the disrespect too great. They began meeting in secret, whispering amongst themselves. What if they simply stopped? What if they refused? What could the great Anunnaki actually do if their workforce simply laid down their tools and walked away? So they did exactly that. After 3,600 years of obedience, the Agigi rebelled. They set fire to their tools. They threw down their baskets and shovels. They marched on the dwelling of Enlil, one of the most powerful of the Anunnaki, surrounding his house in the dead of night. The text describes Enlil's reaction with almost comic precision. He was terrified. A great god, one of the supreme cosmic authorities, cowering inside his own home while his divine workforce rioted outside. The other Anunnaki were summoned. Emergency councils were called. This wasn't just a labor dispute. This was revolution in heaven. The cosmic order itself was breaking down. If the lesser gods could rebel, if they could refuse their appointed roles, then what did that mean for the entire structure of divine authority? What precedent would this set? Here's where the story reveals something chilling about the Anunnaki's character. They didn't respond with understanding or compromise. They didn't recognize the legitimate grievances of beings who had labored for millennia without rest. Instead, they looked for a solution that would preserve their own comfort while ending the rebellion. They needed workers, yes, but clearly divine workers were too problematic. Divine workers could organize. Divine workers could rebel. Divine workers had just enough power to be dangerous when pushed too far. They needed workers who would never have that power. Workers who could be controlled absolutely. Workers who could be created in vast numbers. Who would be grateful simply to exist, who would never dream of surrounding a god's house in the middle of the night with demands for better conditions. They needed workers who would know their place because they had been designed specifically for that place. They needed humans. The Agigi rebellion is presented in the text as the direct catalyst for human creation. We were the solution to a divine labor crisis. the Anunnaki killed one of the rebel gods, a deity named Wheela, and mixed his blood with clay. From this mixture they fashioned the first humans. We inherited divine blood, yes, but we also inherited the purpose of that divine blood, to serve. We were created to replace the Igigi, to take on their burden, to dig the canals and build the temples and perform all the back-breaking labour that even lesser gods had found unbearable. But there's something deeply disturbing about what this story reveals. If gods themselves, beings of cosmic power and immortal life, could be ground down by the Anunnaki's demands until they finally broke and rebelled, what did that mean for humanity? We had been created specifically to be more compliant than gods, more accepting of suffering, more willing to endure. We'd been engineered to tolerate what even divine beings could not. The rebellion of the Igigi tells us that the Anunnaki's cruelty wasn't reserved for humanity alone. Their disregard for the suffering of their servants, their willingness to extract labour without mercy, their complete lack of empathy for those beneath them in the cosmic hierarchy, these were fundamental characteristics. They had treated gods this way, gods who shared divine nature, who breathed celestial air, who had existed since the first moments of cosmic order. And still the Anunnaki had worked them to the point of desperate rebellion. Some researchers have suggested that the Igigi rebellion might represent something historical rather than mythological. Perhaps it was a memory of actual human uprisings, of slave revolts in ancient Mesopotamia that had been projected backward onto a cosmic screen and transformed into divine drama. Maybe the story preserved the memory of labour disputes between different classes or ethnic groups in the earlier cities, conflict so significant they were remembered for millennia in mythological form. Others see in the Igigi something more symbolic. The rebellion of the lesser gods against the greater might represent humanity's own occasional revolts against cosmic order, our periodic attempts to overthrow the powers that claim authority over us. The story might be teaching that such revolts are as old as consciousness itself, that the desire for freedom from oppressive authority is written into the very fabric of creation. But whatever symbolic or historical meaning we might extract, the literal narrative remains deeply unsettling. The gods who created humanity were the same gods who had driven other divine beings to desperate rebellion through sheer cruelty and indifference. We were made to serve masters who had already proven they would accept nothing less than absolute submission, who would grind down their servants, divine or mortal, without the slightest hesitation or remorse. The Igigi had rebelled and achieved something remarkable. They had freed themselves from the burden of eternal labour. They had fought for their dignity and won. But their victory came at humanity's expense. We inherited their chains. But the Anunnaki weren't reasonable creators. The ancient texts tell us that Enlil, the supreme god of earth and air, was disturbed by something completely mundane. Noise. The tablets describe it with chilling simplicity. The clamour of humanity had become too loud. The uproar of mankind disturbed his sleep. Think about that for a moment. Not rebellion, not wickedness, not even disobedience. Just the natural sounds of a thriving civilization going about its daily business. And for this, Enlil decided that every man, woman and child on earth had to die. The Epic of Atrahasis lays it out with terrifying clarity. First, Enlil tried subtler methods. He sent plague to thin the population. When humanity recovered and the noise returned, he sent drought to starve them into silence. When they survived that too, finding ways to irrigate and adapt, he tried famine. Each time, humans proved frustratingly resilient. They mourned their dead, then rebuilt. They buried their children, then had more. They learned, they adapted, they endured, and they kept making noise. So Enlil convened the council of the great gods and proposed something unprecedented. Not punishment for a crime, not correction for a transgression, complete extermination, total annihilation. He would bring a flood so vast, so overwhelming, that not a single human would survive to disturb his rest again. The other Anunnaki agreed. They swore a solemn oath together. Humanity would be wiped from existence, and none of them would warn the humans of what was coming. This wasn't rage. This wasn't even cruelty in the traditional sense. It was something colder. It was the decision to erase an entire species because their existence had become inconvenient. Like swatting mosquitoes that kept you awake at night, except these mosquitoes were sentient beings who worshipped you, who built temples in your honor, who offered you the best of everything they produced. But one god broke the oath. Enki, the god of wisdom and water, the deity who had mixed his blood with clay to create humanity in the first place, couldn't watch his creation be destroyed without giving them a chance. The texts tell us he approached a wall of reeds where a man named Utnapishtim lived. Speaking to the wall rather than directly to the man, thereby technically keeping his oath, Enki delivered a warning. A flood was coming. Build a boat. Save yourself, your family, and representatives of all living things. Was this compassion? Maybe. Or maybe it was defiance. One god's rebellion against another's tyranny. Or perhaps it was pragmatism. Someone would need to make offerings after the flood, and dead humans couldn't maintain temples or provide sacrifices. We don't know Enki's true motivation, the texts don't tell us. They just record that he gave the warning, speaking in riddles to a wall, allowing humanity one thin chance at survival. Utnapishtim built his ark. The descriptions in the ancient tablets are remarkably specific. Dimensions, materials, waterproofing techniques using pitch and bitumen. He loaded it with his family, skilled craftspeople, animals both wild and domestic. His neighbours probably thought he'd gone mad, building a massive boat far from any body of water, muttering about floods in a world that had known only drought. Then the rains came. The Mesopotamian flood accounts describe the deluge with visceral, haunting detail. The storm wasn't just rain. It was darkness made liquid. The sky turned black at noon. Lightning cracked continuously. The foundations of the earth shook. Water burst from below and poured from above simultaneously, as if creation itself was being unmade, reality dissolving back into the primordial chaos from which it had been shaped. And here's where the story takes its most revealing turn. The tablets tell us the gods themselves were terrified. Enlil had unleashed something even they couldn't control. The Anunnaki cowered like dogs, crouching against the outer wall of heaven. The goddess Ishtar cried out in anguish, regretting the decision, lamenting like a woman in childbirth as she watched the destruction. How could I speak evil in the assembly of the gods, she wails in the text, ordering destruction for my people. For 7 days and 7 nights the flood raged. Everything died. Every city was reduced to mud. Every field became an ocean. Every human being who wasn't on Utnapishtim's boat drowned, along with countless animals, plants, and every trace of the civilization humanity had built. The noise that had so disturbed Enlil was finally completely silenced. When the waters receded and Utnapishtim's boat came to rest on a mountain, he emerged to find a world scoured clean. The texts describe his first action with heartbreaking simplicity. He built an altar and made a sacrifice to the gods. The smell of roasting meat rose to heaven, and the Anunnaki, who had been without offerings for months, gathered around it like flies. The tablets literally say they crowded around the sacrifice like flies. These beings who had just committed genocide, now desperate for the offerings only humans could provide. Enlil arrived last, furious to discover that some humans had survived. He demanded to know which god had broken the oath and warned them. The confrontation that followed reveals the twisted logic of divine politics. Enki defended his actions, but not by appealing to mercy or justice. Instead, he pointed out the practical problem. Who would make offerings if all humans were dead? Who would maintain the temples? The gods needed humans, even if they refused to admit it. Eventually Enlil relented, but his solution was telling. Humans could continue to exist, but their numbers would be controlled through new limitations. Infertility for some women, infant mortality, diseases that would keep the population in check, miscarriage and stillbirth, natural disasters spaced regularly to prevent humanity from ever growing too comfortable, too numerous, too loud again. The survivors understood the lesson perfectly. They had been granted continued existence not as a right, but as a provisional privilege that could be revoked at any moment. They lived at the whim of beings who had already demonstrated their willingness to commit total genocide over something as trivial as noise. Every sacrifice, every prayer, every act of worship from that point forward carried the weight of this knowledge. The flood wasn't ancient history to them. It was a promise. Step out of line, becoming convenient again, and the waters would return. This is what the flood story really taught humanity, not that the gods were just or wise or even consistent, but that human life was fundamentally expendable to beings who held absolute power. You existed because you were useful. The moment you stopped being useful, or worse, became annoying, your entire species could be erased as casually as you might blow out a candle. And the most terrifying part, the gods didn't even feel guilty about it. The gods had knowledge. That's what made them gods. And they guarded it like predators guarding a kill. In Mesopotamian belief, civilization itself wasn't something humans discovered or invented. It was something the Anunnaki owned. They called it the ME, divine decrees, fundamental laws, cosmic principles that governed everything from kingship and priesthood to metalworking and warfare, from sexuality and music to law and destruction. The ME wasn't abstract philosophy. These were concrete powers, almost physical objects that could be stolen, traded, or lost, and every single one was under Anunnaki control. Think about what that means. Humans didn't learn to build temples or forge bronze or organize cities through trial and error, through generations of accumulated wisdom. According to the myths, these abilities were divine property, dispensed only when the gods decided humanity had earned them, or more accurately when it served divine purposes. You wanted to know how to smelt copper? That knowledge belonged to the gods. Agriculture, divine gift, writing, handed down from heaven. Even the concept of kingship, the very structure of human government that was me, owned and controlled by the Anunnaki. This wasn't generosity, it was a control mechanism. Every piece of knowledge came with strings attached, with obligations, with the constant reminder that humans existed at divine pleasure. You didn't own your civilization, you were borrowing it. And the gods could revoke the loan any time they wanted. The tablets tell a story that reveals just how tightly the Anunnaki hoarded knowledge. It's the tale of Inanna, goddess of love and war, and her journey to visit Enki, the god of wisdom who resided in the freshwater abyss beneath the world. Enki possessed the ME, all of them, stored in his underwater palace like weapons in an armory. Inanna wanted them. Not for humanity's benefit, but to increase her own power and the prestige of her city, Uruk. So she went to Enki, and being clever, she got him drunk. In his intoxicated state, Enki began giving her the ME one after another. The power of kingship, the art of warfare, sexual attraction, music, metalworking, over 100 divine decrees handed over in a drunken stupor. Inanna loaded them onto her boat and fled. When Enki sobered up and realized what he'd done, he sent monsters and demons to chase her down and retrieve the stolen ME. But Inanna was faster. She made it back to Uruk with the knowledge intact, And Enki, bound by his own drunken promise, had to let her keep them. Here's what's revealing about this story. Even among the gods themselves, knowledge wasn't shared freely. It had to be stolen through trickery and cunning. If the gods themselves had to scheme and manipulate to gain access to civilization's fundamental principles, what hope did humans have? We were so far down the hierarchy that the very concept of us deserving knowledge was laughable. But occasionally humans got close, and the stories of what happened when they did are lessons in divine cruelty. There was Adapa, son of Enki, a priest in the ancient city of Eridu. The tablets describe him as incredibly wise, blessed by his divine father with understanding beyond normal human capacity. He knew the secrets of purification, the proper rituals, the hidden workings of the cosmos. But he was still mortal, still trapped in a body that would age and die. One day while fishing, the south wind capsized his boat. In rage, Adapa cursed the wind so effectively that he broke its wings. The wind stopped blowing across the entire world. This got the attention of Anu, king of the gods. He summoned Adapa to heaven to answer for his action. Before Adapa left, Enki gave him advice. "This sky god will offer you food and water," Enki warned. "Don't accept it. It will be the food and water of death." Enki was protecting his son, or so it seemed. But when Adapa reached heaven, Anu was impressed by this mortal's power and wisdom, so impressed that he decided to grant Adapa immortality. He offered him the bread of life and the water of life. Remembering Enki's warning, Adapa refused. He refused immortality. The one thing every human desperately wanted, the one gift that would have elevated him to divine status. And he turned it down because his own father had lied to him. Some scholars think Enki made a mistake, got confused about what Anu would offer. But look at the pattern. Look at what happens every time a human gets too close to divine status. They're tricked, punished, or destroyed. Enki couldn't have his human son become immortal. That would upset the hierarchy. So he sabotaged him with misinformation disguised as fatherly protection. Adapa returned to Earth still mortal, still bound to die. He had approached the threshold of divinity and been deceived at the last moment. The message was clear. Humans could be wise, could be favored, could even be semi-divine. But they could never cross the final line. That boundary was defended with lies if necessary. This pattern repeats throughout Mesopotamian mythology. Every human who gains too much knowledge, who becomes too powerful, who threatens to approach divine status, they're cut down. Sometimes through deception like Adapa, sometimes through direct violence, sometimes through cursing them with terrible fates. The method varied, but the result was always the same. Humans remained human, inferior, controlled. And then there's kingship itself, the ultimate gift that was actually a chain. According to Sumerian tradition, kingship was lowered from heaven after the flood, a divine institution meant to organize humanity. But look at what kingship actually did. It created a hierarchy with the king at the top, blessed by the gods, speaking with divine authority. The king became the intermediary between heaven and earth, the channel through which divine will flowed to the masses. This was brilliant control mechanism. The Anunnaki didn't have to manage millions of humans directly. They just had to manage one king, who then managed everyone else. The king performed the rituals, built the temples, collected the offerings, and organized the labor. He did it with divine mandate, which meant questioning him was questioning the gods themselves. Rebellion against the king was rebellion against heaven. Every year in some cities the king had to perform a ritual humiliation, where he was stripped of his crown and forced to declare he hadn't neglected the gods. Only then would the high priest reinvest him with authority. This wasn't about humility, it was a reminder. Your power is borrowed. We can take it back any time. The gift of kingship came with a leash. So every advancement in human civilization, Every piece of knowledge that let us build cities and forge metal and organize society, all of it was framed as divine generosity. But the tablets tell a different story. They tell of gods who hoarded knowledge jealously, who parceled it out only when it served their interests, who punished humans for getting too close to divine secrets, who even deceived their own semi-divine offspring to maintain the hierarchy. The gifts weren't gifts at all. They were tools of control, keeping humanity forever dependent, forever subordinate, forever aware that everything we had could be taken away if we displeased our creators. Temples of terror didn't start as stone and brick. They began as an idea, a conviction, slowly hardened into certainty that the Anunnaki were always watching and always needing. Food, drink, music, obedience, your obedience. Over generations, that idea took shape in the landscape itself. In the cities of Mesopotamia, the horizon wasn't ruled by mountains or forests. It was ruled by stair-stepped towers rising out of the flat plains, ziggurats, artificial mountains built for beings who had once, according to the stories, descended from the sky. At first glance, they were just buildings, massive platforms stacked one on another, each level slightly smaller, climbing toward a shrine at the top. But to the people who lived in their shadow, they were more than architecture. They were reminders that the gods lived above you, literally and symbolically. Reminders that your place was below. The ziggurat of Enlil at Nippur, the ziggurat of Inanna at Uruk, the towering structure at Ur dedicated to Nanna, the moon god. Each city had its sacred mountain, and each one was carefully oriented, measured, aligned. Not just to impress other humans, but, in the minds of the builders, to impress the Anunnaki. If you lived there, you would have learned from childhood that the world was a vertical hierarchy. At the ground level, you, mortals. At the summit, gods who could drown the world when they were annoyed. The climb from one level to the next wasn't just a staircase. It was a rank structure in brick. You never forgot that you were at the bottom. Inside and around these towering platforms lay the true heart of Mesopotamian religion, the temple complex. Not simply a place for private prayer, but a bustling, tightly organized system whose entire purpose was to serve the gods as if they were the most demanding rulers imaginable. The divine statues were the center of this system. To modernize, they're just carved figures. Stone, wood, metal. But for the ancient Mesopotamians, once a statue underwent elaborate consecration rituals, it wasn't a representation. It was a body, a physical form for the Anunnaki to inhabit, and bodies need care. Every single day, priests and temple staff woke the gods. They recited specific formulas to rouse the statue from its divine sleep. They brought bowls of water so the god could wash its hands and face. They offered fine garments, jewelry and crowns, dressing the statue the way you would dress a living king. They brought food, bread, dates, meat, beer, wine, laid out delicately on tables before the divine presence, not symbolic food, real food, grown in real fields, harvested by real workers, paid for with real sweat. The god, through the statue, would eat by accepting the essence of the offering. Only after the deity was believed to have taken its share could the leftovers be consumed by priests or redistributed. Every meal an act of submission, every mouthful a reminder that what nourished you first belonged to someone else. There were entertainments too, musicians playing lyres and flutes before impassive stone faces, singers chanting hymns late into the night, processions, incense, perfumes. The gods did not come down to work in the fields. They did not haul water in the heat. They sat, eternally enthroned, and expected the world to orbit around their comfort. The temples made sure that happened. Over time, this constant service crystallized into something massive and far-reaching, the temple economy. Each major deity's house didn't just occupy sacred ground, it owned land, herds, workshops and labourers, farms that fed the god, breweries that brewed for the god, weavers who clothed the god. Tax lists and administrative tablets from cities like and Lagash show just how immense these institutions were. Barley counts, wool tallies, head counts of workers all link directly to the temple. The god, and by extension the Anunnaki as a whole, sat at the top of an economic pyramid as steep as any ziggurat. You, as an ordinary person, weren't simply a worshipper. You were part of the supply chain. Your labour, your harvest, your animals, everything you produced was, in theory, owed first to the divine estate. Neglect your obligation, and you weren't just skipping a donation. You were risking cosmic disfavour, drought, flood, disease. And in a world where survival was precarious, angering beings who controlled the weather and fertility was unthinkable. Between you and those unseen powers stood the priests. They weren't just religious specialists, they were translators, interpreters of a dangerous language. The gods in these stories rarely spoke plainly. They sent signs, faint omens hidden in dreams, in the flight of birds, in the livers of sacrificed animals. So priests watched the skies, interpreted eclipses, decoded strange births of animals. They read cracked patterns in heated bones. They turned ambiguous events into sentences. Enlil is displeased. Inanna requires more offerings. The Anunnaki threaten war, plague, or famine unless something changes. If a priest announced that the gods were angry, you believed it. Because if he was wrong, everyone would suffer. If he was right and you didn't act, the Anunnaki's reputation suggested you'd pay dearly. This power to interpret divine moods gave priests immense authority. They controlled not only ritual, but access. Ordinary people rarely climbed to the highest levels of the ziggurat or stepped into the deepest chambers of the sanctuary. Those areas were reserved for the initiated, for the ones who claimed they knew what the gods wanted. And sometimes what the gods wanted was blood. Evidence for human sacrifice in Mesopotamia is more limited than in some later cultures, but it isn't absent. Certain royal burials at the city of show attendants, soldiers and musicians laid out beside their rulers in carefully arranged patterns, as if they had accompanied their king into death, willingly or not. Official texts tend to emphasize animal sacrifice, sheep, goats, bulls. But hints remain that in moments of extreme crisis, defeat in war, terrifying eclipses, long droughts, the boundary might have shifted. Echoes in later myths and ritual texts speak of substitutes offered up, proxy kings enthroned briefly and then removed, as if one human life could be used to deflect the fury of many gods. Whether these stories record literal killings or symbolic dramas, they reveal a mindset soaked in fear. Better one person perish, the logic runs, than the Anunnaki unleash their full wrath on the city. Even where blood was not demanded, devotion could still be extreme. Long fasts, grueling vigils, self-abnegation. Hymns describe worshippers beating their chests, tearing their garments, weeping in front of the divine statues, begging for mercy they were never sure they'd receive. And those hymns are blunt about the relationship. In many cultures, poets soften the distance between human and divine with tender metaphors, child and parent, lover and beloved. In Mesopotamia, another metaphor dominates, master and slave. Temple songs and prayers routinely call humans the black-headed people, the servants of the gods. One hymn to a great deity praises him as the one before whom kings bow like servants, whose word is a yoke upon the neck of all. Another text has a supplicant declare, I am your slave who fears your anger, who trembles at your glance. The language isn't accidental. It's a theological statement. The Anunnaki made humanity, according to the myths, for one primary reason, to work, to carry the load the younger gods refused to carry, to take on the endless, grinding tasks of maintaining creation so divine beings wouldn't have to. Temples turned that myth into lived reality. The architecture drove the point home. Stand at the base of a ziggurat and look up. The stairs are narrow. The walls rise sheer. The central shrine where the god statue resides is small compared to the vast base supporting it. Everything in the design draws your eyes upward to a place you cannot reach. The lowest levels, where markets, storerooms and workshops hummed with activity, were crowded with human bodies. The highest level, where the divine presence was believed to dwell, was restricted, quiet, mysterious. The message was as solid as the bricks. The many below exist to uphold the one above. Even the act of climbing was controlled. Only certain people, at certain times, following certain rituals, could ascend. For everyone else, the temple was something you circled but never fully entered. A physical symbol of a cosmic structure. The Anunnaki at the top, unknowable and dangerous. You at the bottom, necessary but expendable. And yet, despite the fear, despite the constant reminders of your smallness, you kept serving. You brought offerings. You joined processions. You sang the hymns that called you a slave. Because in a world where floods could erase cities overnight, where plagues could halve a population, where empires rose and fell in the space of a lifetime, the Anunnaki were terrible, but they were also predictable in their unpredictability. If you followed the rules, if you respected the hierarchy, if you bowed in the right direction and spoke the right words, then maybe, just maybe, their vast attention would pass over you without harm. In the shadow of the ziggurats, worship wasn't just reverence. It was insurance. It was negotiation with forces that could crush you without noticing. It was submission, written in mud brick and blood, into the very bones of the first cities. If you lived in ancient Sumer or Akkad, you didn't just fear invaders, drought, or disease. You feared mood swings in heaven. Because in the Mesopotamian imagination, disaster was rarely just bad luck. It was a verdict, a sentence, a sign that somewhere, somehow, the Anunnaki had turned their faces away. Or worse, were looking directly at you. The people of learned this the hard way. For centuries, had been one of the jewels of southern Mesopotamia, a city of canals and warehouses, of scribes and merchants, of priests who believed they knew how to keep the gods fed and content. Its ziggurat rose above the flat plain like a man-made mountain, a stairway for the gods to descend and rest among their worshippers. And then, in a span of years that must have felt like the sky collapsing, it was ruined. We don't just have ruins in the sand. We have voices. The Sumerian lamentation over the destruction of reads like an eyewitness account of divine abandonment. It says the Anunnaki gathered in their assembly and made a terrible decision. The city was doomed. Not because its people had stopped worshipping, not because its rituals had failed, simply because, as the text puts it, the storm that annihilates the land had been commanded. The lament describes the city's fall as if the gods themselves were leading the siege. Storms howling through the streets, temples torn open, corpses piled in the gates. It says the protective deities, the very gods who were supposed to guard left their shrines and took the road to heaven, abandoning their people like a landlord walking away from a burning house. The priests and scribes who wrote these laments didn't say, "Our enemies were stronger." They said, "Our gods withdrew their favor. The Anunnaki changed their minds." One moment, you were the beloved city of the moon god Nana. The next, you were a cautionary tale, a smoking ruin littered with broken statues and silent altars. But this was only one example in a long tradition of divine brutality. Consider Inanna. Inanna was the goddess of love, fertility and war, patroness of passion, of kingship, of victory. But in Mesopotamian myth, love and war were never gentle things. Inanna's favour could exalt you. Her anger could grind you to dust. In one of the most haunting stories, Inanna's descent to the underworld, she decides to visit the realm ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. The reasons are never fully clear. Is it ambition? Curiosity? A challenge? The text is ambiguous, and that ambiguity is part of the terror. The gods do not explain themselves, they simply act. As Inanna passes each of the 7 gates to the underworld, the gatekeeper strips away a piece of her power, her crown, her jewellery, her robes. By the time she stands before Ereshkigal, she is naked and powerless. There, the Queen of the Dead fixes her with the eye of death. Inanna is judged, struck down, and hung like a carcass on a hook. While she's gone, the world above begins to die. Crops wither. Love stops. Fertility disappears. The simple acts of living and reproducing grind to a halt. One goddess's misstep, one impulsive descent, and humanity finds itself staring at extinction, not because it sinned, but because a divine family dispute has spilled over into the mortal world. Even Inanna's return is soaked in blood. To escape, she must provide a substitute to take her place below. She chooses her husband, Dumuzi, not because he's done anything uniquely terrible, but because she finds him dressed in fine clothes, sitting comfortably, not wailing for her like everyone else. His apparent lack of grief seals his fate. Demons drag him down to the underworld. His screams become the seasonal cycle. Part of the year he returns and the world blooms. Part of the year he is dead and the land mourns. The message is unmistakable. Your life might be the price of a god's wounded pride. Your harvest might hinge on whether a goddess thinks your expression is sorrowful enough. And if that sounds extreme, the myths of Nergal and Ereshkigal go further. Nergal is a god of plague and war, a personification of sudden, wasting death. In one story he insults Ereshkigal by refusing to rise from his throne when her messenger arrives at the council of the gods. To repair this offence he's ordered to descend and make amends. But in the underworld, anger and desire mix in dangerous ways. Nergal and Ereshkigal become lovers, then enemies, then rulers together of the land of no return. Different versions of the tale disagree on the details, but they agree on the tone. Violence is baked into divine relationships. In some versions, Nergal storms the underworld, dragging Ereshkigal from her throne, threatening to behead her. In others, she clings to him, begging him not to leave, promising to share her power if he stays. For humans listening to these stories, the conclusion was clear. If gods could threaten and torment each other like this, if their love affairs ended in power struggles and hostage-taking, what chance did ordinary mortals have? The rulers of fate were not serene, omnibenevolent beings. They were volatile, jealous, dangerous, and their quarrels shook the foundations of the human world. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia carry this fear into something more practical, more intimate. Curses. Kings, priests, and wealthy families carved their anxieties into stone and clay. At the end of legal documents, land grants, boundary stones, they would attach long series of threats. They invoked the Anunnaki by name. They called on Nanna, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, Nergal, Ereshkigal, and hosts of lesser gods to cripple anyone who altered the text, moved the marker, or challenged the owner. The curses are vivid. May the Anunnaki extinguish his seed. May his house become a ruin heap. May famine stalk his children. May his name be erased from memory. May the underworld claim him before his time. These weren't just poetic flourishes. They were legal armor, backed by the most terrifying enforcement mechanism imaginable. Divine wrath. Even ordinary letters and incantations could contain smaller versions of these curses. If someone wronged you, and the courts were weak, You could ask the gods to balance the scales with plague, misfortune, or a line of descendants that failed one by one, like torches going out in the wind. When real plagues came, when real famines hit, when wars ripped across the alluvial plains, no one assumed it was purely natural. Epidemics were the arrows of Nergal. Drought was a sign that Enlil had withheld the life-giving winds. A failed harvest might mean the grain goddess had been offended, or that some ritual somewhere had been performed incorrectly. But here is the part that gnawed at people's sleep. Sometimes the wicked prospered. Sometimes the devout were trampled first. The lamentation over Ur makes it painfully clear that the city's ritual life had been vigorous. Its temples were not neglected, its priests were not lazy. Yet when the decision came down from the divine assembly, there was no appeal. The text says the Anunnaki would not change their word. Prayers echoed in empty sanctuaries. Sacrifices smoked on altars that no longer had anyone to smell them. This randomness, or what looked like randomness from below, created a particular kind of religious anxiety. You could obey every rule, offer every sacrifice, murmur every correct line of every hymn, and still be swept away in the divine storm. You could be Dumuzi, picked not for any crime, but for being in the wrong place at the wrong emotional temperature when the goddess looked your way. So people doubled down. They added more rituals, more offerings, more laments. They composed elaborate prayers begging the gods not just for favour, but for insight into what they had done wrong. Diviners examined animal livers, the movements of stars, the shape of smoke rising from incense, trying desperately to read the gods' intentions before the next disaster struck. Living under the Anunnaki meant never being sure, never knowing if your city was beloved or already sentenced, never certain if a cough was just a cough or the first whisper of Nergal. In that uncertainty, fear became a permanent part of religious life. Not just awe, not just respect, but a deep, sleepless dread that the next decree from the divine assembly might erase everything you'd built, everything you loved without warning and without explanation. The Anunnaki's power didn't end when you stopped breathing. If anything, that's where it became most terrifying. In Mesopotamia, death didn't mean judgment between heaven and hell. It meant a one-way journey to a place called Kur, or Irkala. Not a lake of fire, not a shining paradise, just the land of no return. A realm beneath the earth where sunlight never reached, where rivers were made of dust and shadows drank from them anyway. Every person who died went there. It didn't matter if you'd been kind or cruel, generous or greedy, priest or criminal. Your destination was the same. The best you could hope for was a slightly less miserable eternity, if your family remembered to feed your ghost with offerings. But the underlying fact never changed. You were going down. Picture this. You've spent your whole life trying to appease beings who are stronger than storms and older than kings. You've worked, sacrificed, prayed, obeyed. If you're lucky, your fields produce enough grain. Your house survives the floods. Your children live long enough to have children of their own. Then you die. And instead of reward, instead of rest, you find yourself in Irkala, a house of dust, where people eat clay and wear feathers instead of fine clothes, where even the dead look at you with the blank curiosity of those who know nothing better is coming. The journey there was as important as the destination. Ancient texts talk about 7 gates leading down into the underworld, 7 thresholds that separated the living world from the dead. At each gate something was taken from you. Not just clothing or jewelry, but status, power, identity. Every step deeper, another layer stripped away, until nothing remained but a naked, shivering soul. The most famous traveller through these gates wasn't human at all. It was Inanna, the goddess of love and war, queen of heaven herself, In the poem often called The Descent of Inanna, she decides to visit her sister Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld. At the first gate, the gatekeeper stops her and sends word down to Ereshkigal. The command comes back, let her in, but according to the rules. So at the first gate, Inanna removes her crown, at the second, her earrings, at the third, her necklace. At each gate, something that symbolized her authority is taken. Her breastplate, her bracelets, her royal garments. By the time she reaches the seventh gate, the goddess who ruled the skies stands naked and powerless in front of the judges of the dead. And then it gets worse. The Anunnaki of the underworld look at her. The text says their eyes are the eyes of death, their voices the voices of a flood. They fix their gaze on her, and their judgment is absolute. They do not see a beloved goddess. They see a trespasser. They pass sentence, and Inanna is killed. Her corpse is hung on a hook. Even the Queen of Heaven can be stripped, humiliated, and destroyed in the realm below. If this is how they treated one of their own, imagine how they treated you. In some texts, the Anunnaki are described as the great judges of the underworld, 7 in number, seated in a dark hall where the dead are gathered. The dead stand before them, not to receive a verdict of heaven or hell, but to be assigned their place in this shadowy society of ghosts. Their decisions could grant you a slightly better corner of the darkness, or leave you wandering, thirsty and forgotten. But there was no escape clause, no moral loophole, no promise that if you lived a righteous life you might rise into the light. The Mesopotamian afterlife was not about justice, it was about inevitability. The Anunnaki did not reward you for your virtue. They managed you, they categorized you, they made sure you stayed where you belonged. This absence of paradise is one of the most unsettling things about their religion. Later belief systems would offer hope, a garden, a kingdom, a rebirth, some kind of cosmic reward for good behavior. Mesopotamian religion, especially in its earlier phases, didn't really do that. The best outcome was to be remembered, to have descendants pour beer into the ground for you, leave bread at your shrine, call your name so your ghost didn't starve in the dark. Why was there no shining heaven for ordinary people? One possibility is brutally simple. The gods of Mesopotamia were not in the business of comfort. They were in the business of control. If the underworld awaits everyone equally, then your only chance to improve your lot is in life, here and now. And if the gods hold the keys to reign, fertility, victory and survival, your attention stays firmly fixed on them. You don't dream of escaping their reach after death. You focus on not angering them while you still can. The hopelessness of Irkalla made obedience logical. If all you can expect in death is dust and darkness, then you cling desperately to whatever stability you can find in life. You follow rituals to the letter. You bring offerings even when grain is scarce. You submit to kings who claim to be chosen, or even part divine, because maybe their closeness to the Anunnaki will keep your village from being washed away or burned or cursed with disease. Even at the very top of society, there was no ultimate exemption. Kings like Gilgamesh, legendary heroes whose deeds were carved into stone, still face the same underworld as everyone else. The Epic of Gilgamesh is, at its core, the story of a man who realizes this. After losing his friend Enkidu, Gilgamesh is shattered by the realization that death comes even for him. He goes on a long, desperate quest to find immortality, to escape the fate of all mortals. He fails. At one point he learns that the gods reserve true immortality for themselves and for a single human couple who survived the Great Flood. Everyone else, no matter how brave, no matter how beloved, goes down to the house whose inhabitants do not come up. Gilgamesh returns to his city, wiser but deeply aware that his only real victory is to build something that will outlast him. Walls, temples, stories, not a heavenly afterlife, but memory carved into earth. This is what made the Anunnaki so uniquely fearsome. They didn't just control the storms, the rivers, the harvests, the fate of cities. They controlled the one realm you could never avoid. There was no frontier beyond their reach, no distant Elysium where you might finally be safe from their moods. Even in death, you entered a system they managed, a house they ruled, a darkness they supervised. In that world, religion wasn't just comfort for the grieving. It was a constant negotiation with beings who held every card. You didn't pray to them because you loved them. You prayed because you knew that from the first breath you took to the last grain of dust you swallowed in Akala, your existence unfolded under their gaze. By now, the Anunnaki have taken shape in your mind as terrifying, otherworldly powers. But still, firmly rooted in the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, lists of gods, hymns, myths of creation and flood, kings kneeling in dust. That's the world the ancient scribes knew. But in the late 20th century, someone looked at those same tablets and saw something very different. In 1976, an Azerbaijani-born researcher named Zechariah Sitchin published a book called The 12th Planet. He wasn't a trained Assyriologist. He wasn't part of the academic establishment. But he claimed to have done something bold, to retranslate the Sumerian and Akkadian texts with completely fresh eyes. Where scholars saw myths, Sitchin said he saw history. Where they saw poetry, he said he saw science. According to Sitchin, the Anunnaki were not just gods of sky and underworld. They were travellers, not from a distant mountain or a hidden cosmic ocean, but from a real, physical world. A wandering planet he called Nibiru. In standard Mesopotamian studies, Nibiru is a celestial term, a star, a crossing point, sometimes associated with Jupiter or the North Star or a specific point on the ecliptic, a flexible symbol in a complex astronomical tradition. But Sitchin read the word differently. He said Nibiru was an actual planet on a huge, elongated orbit around the Sun, entering the inner solar system only once every 3,600 years. A rogue world, dark and distant, but periodically sweeping close to Earth. In his telling, it was from Nibiru that the Anunnaki came, hundreds of thousands of years ago, not as spirits or metaphors, but as flesh and blood beings with technology so advanced it would appear magical to early humans. They descended, he said, not in chariots of wind or storm, but in craft that could cross the void between stars. They came seeking resources, and they found a planet rich in what they needed. Gold. In the mythic texts, the gods complain of labour, of digging, of maintaining canals, shaping rivers, managing fields. In orthodox readings, this is divine drama, a way to explain why humans must work so hard. But Sitchin drew a different conclusion. He connected the Anunnaki's toil to mining. He imagined primitive extraction sites in Africa and Mesopotamia, where the Anunnaki dug for gold and other precious materials needed to maintain their own world, their own atmosphere. In his reconstruction, the Igigi rebellion was no longer just a story of younger gods rising up against older ones. It was a labour strike. Overworked extraterrestrial miners refusing to descend into the shafts one more time, refusing to bear the burden of endless, dangerous work. And just as our earlier sections described, the solution was the same. Create a new worker. A hybrid being, strong enough to toil, smart enough to follow instructions, but limited enough not to challenge the hierarchy. In mainstream translations, the Enki and Ninmah stories, the Atrahasis epic, and other creation myths describe the gods mixing clay with the blood of a slain deity to fashion humans. They speak of gestation goddesses, a birth goddess, an embryonic mould for mankind. Metaphorically, this is about dependence, about humanity's debt to the divine, about a mixture of earth and heaven. Sitchin looked at the same lines and saw biotechnology. For him, clay was not just mud from a riverbank. It was a symbol for existing hominid DNA. The blood of a god was not just ritual imagery. It was an infusion of extraterrestrial genes. The mixing and fashioning became a kind of ancient description of genetic engineering, crude in language, sophisticated in content. The birth goddesses became surrogate mothers, carrying the first human hybrids to term. The Anunnaki in this scenario were not inventing humans from nothing. They were upgrading, modifying, taking a primate already on the brink of awareness and pushing it over the edge. This is the heart of the ancient astronaut theory as it relates to the Anunnaki, that our species is the product of deliberate intervention, that we were designed to be a labor force, and that the dread ancient Mesopotamians felt toward their gods was not misplaced awe toward invisible spirits, but inherited fear of very real, very powerful visitors who could appear and disappear at will, who controlled life, death, and the fate of whole cities with a kind of technology indistinguishable from divine wrath. Supporters of this view point to several kinds of supposed evidence. They note that Mesopotamian astronomers had surprisingly detailed knowledge for such an early civilization. They tracked planets, predicted eclipses, mapped the sky with precision. Some argue that such sophistication appears too quickly, as if it were taught rather than discovered over long ages. Sitchin went further, claiming that references to 12 heavenly bodies, sun, moon, and 10 planets, hint at Nibiru lurking beyond our current sight. He saw the familiar 7 sages, the Apkallu, and the divine Me, or decrees of civilization as technology transfers, not just cultural symbols. Others point to the uncanny blend of myth and biology in the creation stories, the focus on blood, bone, semen, wombs, the repeated theme of fashioning humans to carry a yoke, bear a burden. They argue that this sounds less like spontaneous myth-making and more like a distorted memory of something our distant ancestors actually witnessed but couldn't fully understand. Still others look at global patterns, flood myths echoing Atrahasis and Gilgamesh in cultures far from Mesopotamia, gods descending from the sky in fiery chariots in many traditions, sudden leaps in tool-making, agriculture, urban planning. They ask whether all of this might be ripples from the same deep, hidden event, contact with a non-human intelligence that nudged us forward for its own reasons. But then the other side of the scale comes in, the scholars, the people who have spent lifetimes learning Sumerian grammar, Akkadian syntax, the nuances of cuneiform signs. Professional Assyriologists are almost unanimous on Sitchin. They say he simply misread the texts, that he forced modern concepts like planet, orbit, and genetic engineering onto words that meant something very different in their original context. They point out basic translation errors, words that mean crossing or ferry turned into the name of a hidden planet, routine celestial omens transformed into spaceflight logs. Where Sitchin reads Nibiru as a 12th planet, specialists see a moving marker in the sky, sometimes Jupiter, sometimes the pole star, sometimes a symbolic crossing point. Where he sees genetic labs, they see the standard ancient Near Eastern language of potters and wombs, of craftsmen and birth goddesses, used across many cultures to express the mystery of life. And they remind us that almost every early civilization used myth to encode their understanding of the world, mixing observation with imagination, the way a dream mixes fragments of waking life with pure invention. From their perspective, the Anunnaki are powerful, yes, and terrifying, yes, but still firmly within the realm of myth and cult. They are personifications of cosmic order and chaos, of kingship and fate. The dread they inspire is psychological, social, theological, not technological. So where does that leave us? Somewhere in between, in that uneasy place where hard evidence ends and possibility begins. We know this much. The cuneiform tablets are real. The gods' names are real. The fear ancient people felt was real. We also know that the universe is vast beyond comprehension, and that life, once it appears, has a tendency to spread. explore, and experiment. It's not impossible that intelligent beings older than our species could exist or have existed. It's not impossible that contact could have happened, somewhere, sometime. We just don't have proof that the Anunnaki were those beings. What we do have is a story that resonates deeply with modern anxieties and hopes. In a world where technology advances faster than our ethics, the idea that we were engineered hits a nerve. When we edit genes, build AI, and talk casually about colonizing other planets, the notion that someone did that to us long ago feels strangely symmetrical. The image of humans as a worker species, created to serve, mirrors modern fears about exploitation, loss of autonomy, and systems so big we can barely comprehend them. And there's something else. The ancient astronaut theory offers a way to bridge the gap between science fiction and sacred text. It lets people who grew up with religious stories keep those stories, but reinterpret them through a cosmic lens. Instead of discarding the gods, it turns them into travelers. Instead of abandoning myth, it recasts myth as a distorted chronicle of a very old, very strange history. Whether that history is real or not, the theory persists because it gives shape to our questions. Why are we here? Why are we so strangely intelligent, so fearful, so obsessed with power? Why did our ancestors imagine gods who were both creators and cruel taskmasters? The tablets don't answer for sure. The sky stays silent. But in that silence, imaginations work. Some see only poetry and parable. Others see spacecraft and gene splicers. And between those visions lies a shadowed landscape of possibility, where the Anunnaki stand not just as ancient gods of fear, but as mirrors for our own evolving understanding of what it means to be created, to be controlled, and perhaps, someday, to be the ones who create in turn. By the time Sumer faded and new empires rose out of its ruins, the Anunnaki should have disappeared with the crumbling mud-brick cities that first invoke their names, but they didn't. They flowed forward, the way underground water slips from one spring to the next, invisible beneath the surface but still shaping everything built on top of it. The Babylonians inherited more than Sumerian cities. They inherited Sumerian fears. They took the old stories and rewrote them in their own dialect, reshaped the gods but kept the emotional core intact. In the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, the world is born from the corpse of a slain primordial goddess, and the victor, Marduk, becomes king of the gods. On the surface, it's a tale of cosmic order triumphing over chaos, but listen a little closer and you can still hear the Anunnaki lurking underneath. The idea that the gods rule because they won a violent, bloody conflict. The sense that creation itself rests on an act of divine brutality. The message that power belongs to the strongest, and everyone below exists at the mercy of those above. That's pure Anunnaki thinking. Babylonian priests folded the old Anunnaki into new hierarchies. Some of them became judges of the underworld. Others faded into titles and epithets, absorbed into greater gods like Enlil and later Marduk. But the emotional tone stayed the same. The gods might be given new names, new symbols, new temples, but the people still approach them with a mixture of awe and deep, gnawing anxiety. Offerings weren't just acts of devotion. They were protection payments. As Assyria rose to power in the north, turning warfare into a near-sacred craft, their religion darkened in step. The king was no longer just a servant of the gods, he was their chosen weapon. Assyrian inscriptions describe their kings as unleashed by the gods to devastate cities, to flay enemies, to erase nations. Behind that imagery is a familiar idea, the divine as a terrifying, unpredictable force that can obliterate you without warning. When Assyrian armies sacked a city, burned its fields, and led chained captives away, it wasn't only politics, it was theology, acted out in blood and fire. a living reenactment of the old stories where heaven's rulers crush rebellions and drown those who displease them. The Anunnaki may no longer have been named outright, but their legacy lingered in the way people imagined divine power as something to be placated, not trusted. Somewhere within this cultural storm, other traditions began to form. Among them, the stories that would later be written down in the Hebrew Bible. When you place Mesopotamian myths next to biblical narratives, eerie parallels appear, like reflections in dark water. The flood story is the clearest. In the Sumerian and Akkadian versions, the gods decide humanity is too noisy, too troublesome, too numerous. They send a flood not because humans have sinned in a moral sense, but because humans are inconvenient. A single man is warned in secret, builds a boat, survives with a small group, sends out birds, lands on a mountain. Afterward, the gods regret the scale of the destruction and agree to limit their punishments in the future. In the book of Genesis, the pattern repeats. Humanity, a single chosen survivor, an ark, birds, a mountain, a covenant. But the motive changes. The biblical God floods the world not because humans allowed, but because they are corrupt. The disaster becomes a moral judgment, not just an act of divine irritation. It's as if an older template of fear has been taken and repurposed. The bones of the story are Mesopotamian. The heartbeat inside is different. The same can be said for the Nephilim, those mysterious beings mentioned briefly in Genesis, the mighty men of old, born from the union of divine beings and human women. Their shadow looks suspiciously like older stories of gods and semi-divine heroes in Mesopotamia. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero is 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, towering over ordinary people, performing feats of strength that border on the impossible. The boundary between human and God is thin, dangerous, and often crossed. Babylonian scribes, biblical writers, and countless storytellers in between wrestled with these blurry lines. Were these hybrid beings protectors, tyrants, or something in between? The Nephilim are mentioned only briefly, but the tone surrounding them is uneasy. They're not simply glorious demigods. They are part of a world so troubling that it ends in a flood. The Tower of Babel carries the same uneasy echo. Human beings gathering on the plain of Shinar, another name for Mesopotamia, build a tower that reaches toward heaven. The deity descends, sees what they're doing, and scatters them by confusing their language. On one level, it's an origin story for why people speak different tongues. On another, it feels like a direct critique of the towering ziggurats that rose over Mesopotamian cities, those artificial mountains meant to bridge heaven and earth, to give priests and kings access to divine power. In the older Mesopotamian worldview, building temples higher, grander, more imposing was a way of honoring and approaching terrifying gods. In the biblical story, that upward ambition becomes suspicious. The deity doesn't destroy the tower with a flood or fire, but the message is still clear. There are limits humans are not meant to cross. Across these stories, you can trace a slow shift, from many dangerous competing gods to one god whose danger is absolute. In the polytheistic world of the Anunnaki, fear is scattered. You might offend a storm god, a grain goddess, a river spirit, an ancestral deity. Any one of them could target you. But they can also be played against each other, bargained with, balanced. A divine council means divine politics. As the idea of a single, all-powerful deity takes shape, that fear is condensed. It becomes focused. Instead of navigating a fractured divine court, you face one presence that sees everything, knows everything, judges everything. In some ways it's less chaotic, in other ways it's far more intense. The Anunnaki punish cities with plagues, with floods, with famine. Later texts describe a god who can do all of that and also judge the secret intentions of your heart. The battlefield of divine wrath moves inward, from the outer world of storms and rivers to the inner world of conscience and morality. Yet the emotional thread doesn't break. It stretches. People still fear drought and disease, but they also fear being found wanting, measured and weighed by a gaze that never blinks. The old dread of angering the grain god becomes the modern dread of failing a cosmic moral standard. The tools change, the anxiety remains. Over thousands of years, that fear of divine punishment seeped into law codes, rituals, and daily habits. Oaths were sworn before the gods in Mesopotamia. Later, they were sworn on holy books, on the name of a single god, on sacred relics. Breaking them meant not just social consequences, but spiritual peril. The Anunnaki once judged souls in the underworld, assigning them to a dusty, joyless fate. Later traditions imagine more elaborate systems, heavens and hells, weighing of hearts, books of life. The details differ across cultures and religions, but the underlying logic is familiar. What you do in life will be examined by a power beyond you, and the verdict will matter. Even now, in a world full of science and satellites, the Anunnaki have not entirely retreated into ancient tablets. They've reappeared in conspiracies and science fiction, in video games and novels, in documentaries that blur the line between scholarship and speculation. Some imagine them as ancient astronauts, stern genetic engineers who created humanity as a labor force. Others cast them as shadowy puppet masters, still influencing events through secret bloodlines and hidden technologies. These modern stories are rarely faithful to the ancient texts, but they reveal something far more interesting than historical accuracy. They show how eagerly we return to the oldest pattern: powerful beings above, fragile humans below, and a deep suspicion that our fate is being decided by forces we don't fully understand. Why do these narratives grip us so strongly? Maybe because they mirror how the world has always felt: unpredictable, dangerous, indifferent to our plans. The earliest farmers watching a river rise too high or not enough. The earliest city dwellers watching empires swallow their homes. The earliest temple goers standing in front of a statue wondering if the god inside would help them or crush them. The Anunnaki gave those fears a face, a name, a story. Later religions reshaped that face, softened some lines, sharpened others, but the emotional structure remained remarkably consistent. A sense that we are small, that there are powers beyond us, that our actions matter somehow in ways we can't entirely see. When you listen closely to the tales of divine wrath and judgment that echo through Babylonian hymns, biblical narratives, medieval sermons, and even modern apocalyptic films, you can still hear a faint ancient whisper. It comes from the first cities on the Mesopotamian plain, from the first people who looked up at the ziggurats, at the storms, at the dark underworld they imagined beneath their feet and felt a shiver. The whisper says, "The gods are watching, the gods are dangerous, and your survival depends on understanding them, or at least on trying." The stories repeat the same lesson in different forms. Disobedience brings plagues. Noise brings floods. Pride brings annihilation. Even loyalty doesn't guarantee safety. A city can honor its gods for centuries and still be abandoned to famine or war when the divine mood shifts. This is not the language of comfort. It's the language of managing a dangerous power you can't escape. And yet, people told these stories for thousands of years. They copied them, recited them, carved them into clay, knowing a single mistake could ruin the whole text. Why keep such terrifying tales alive? Maybe because they reflected the world as ancient people actually experienced it. Rivers that flooded without warning, droughts that stretched on for years, empires that rose and fell in a single lifetime. To them, the universe didn't feel kind or fair. It felt like a negotiation with something vast, unpredictable, easily angered. The Anunnaki were a way of giving that chaos a face, a name, a set of rules you could at least try to follow. Or maybe these stories survived because they carried something deeper, a warning about power, a reminder that those who create you, rule you, or bless you can also destroy you. A quiet recognition that dependence and dread often grow from the same root. As you lie here, listening across the distance of 4,000 years, you might wonder, how much of that fear still lives in us? When we think of fate, or luck, or the universe, do we secretly imagine a modern version of the Anunnaki, capricious, watching, waiting? Are our own stories of higher powers, alien visitors, or distant gods just new masks for very old anxieties? Or were the Anunnaki something else entirely? Memories of forgotten rulers, echoes of real catastrophes, or shadows of visitors we still don't understand? No one can say for certain. All we have are fragments, whispers in clay, and the uneasy feeling that our ancestors were trying to tell us something important about living in a world that can turn on you without warning. If you've enjoyed wandering through these ancient shadows, you're welcome to like this video, subscribe for more journeys into the half-light of history, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from, which corner of the modern world is hearing these very old fears. For now, let the storms of the ancient gods fade into the distance. The temples are quiet. The clay tablets are at rest. The Anunnaki, if they ever walk the earth, are long gone. What remains is the soft echo of their stories and your own steady breath in the dark. You're safe. The night is calm, and the terrors of the ancient world can stay where they belong, far behind you, folded gently into sleep.